My name is Ann Arbor, and I'm the president of the board of directors of the Fair Housing Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th annual Fair Housing Breakfast. Before we start, I have just a couple housekeeping matters. Food will stay out until 10, and the hashtag is hashtag FHB breakfast. So if you're into that, there it is. Obviously, you can tell I'm not so much. So we are so excited that the Fair Housing Center breakfasts have continued, and now we're in our 6th year, and we continue to grow in attendance each time. This event represents a significant moment for us each year as we continue to confront our history, explore strategies, and keep the conversation going as we leave this room, as we all share in the mission of the Fair Housing Center to work to end discrimination and promote accessible, integrated communities. But we also take time today to celebrate an individual who is an essential, valued partner in the work of the Fair Housing Center. But first, let's take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors who make it possible for us to gather each year. So we have our gold sponsors, McKinley and the Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development. Our silver sponsors, Ann Arbor State Bank, the Chemical Bank, Home Point Financial, PNC Bank. Our bronze sponsors, the Ann Arbor Area Board of Realtors, the Bank of Ann Arbor, Comerica Bank, Flagstar Bank, Liberty Title, Lombardo Homes, Michigan Realtors, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, Old National Bank, Plant Moran, Reinhardt Realtors, the University of Michigan Credit Union, and Zingerman's Community of Businesses. So let's applaud. And thank you to all of you who have come here today, particularly those who have recently become first-time members. If you are not yet a member of the Fair Housing Center, please consider joining today. The Fair Housing Center relies on memberships to continue their mission to end discrimination and to promote accessible, integrated communities. We need your resources. We all need to share in the struggle financially if we're able. So now I would like to introduce the other members of the board of directors and ask them to come join me up here in front. So I believe Mike Apple is here, Mark Mitchkin, Kim Moore, I haven't seen her, Edward Moorman, Alexandra Murphy, Gail Rosen, and then Delphia Simpson. So I think Delphia and Kim are not here. Why don't you all come up here as we present our Board of Directors Award. So, and you should thank all of these people. They all volunteer a significant amount of time, especially to problem solve with Pam and the staff over those funding crises such as we've had recently with the government shutdown. Something like that really impacts the Fair Housing Center, another reason we need your dollars. So the hat I wear most often is that as the director of the Michigan Advocacy Program, the local legal services program. In late 2017 and throughout the first half of 2018, we moved from our little house in Ann Arbor, and we had the opportunity to renovate an old, dilapidated, long vacant furniture store in downtown Ypsilanti. And we got to work with an amazing team through that process. And as we consolidated several of our offices and brought these services closer to where our client community is. Our architect throughout this process was David Esau of Cornerstone Architects. We learned immediately that David is a very patient person, working with some nonprofit people who want something great but don't have a lot of money. But he was also focused on the details to make sure that our building was comfortable, very beautiful, but also made sure that it was accessible to our staff and our client community. We spent many Thursday mornings with him, and just once he mentioned that he worked a little bit with the Fair Housing Center. I learned that that was quite an understatement after I talked to Pam. Over the years, David Esau has consulted on at least 20 cases with the Fair Housing Center and their cooperating attorneys. Those cases include the Fair Housing Center versus Oak Ridge, Lowry versus Upton, and Tankson versus Randolph Court. You might remember this case from our program last year. Many of you will remember that story, but David has helped the Fair Housing Center evaluate properties all over Southeast and Mid-Michigan, including the communities of Lansing, Hazlitt, Holt, Saline, Ann Arbor, and Ypsilanti. To give you a fuller picture, I want to share the story of one of these cases. This is Fry versus Parkway Meadows. Ms. Fry had a disability. When she could no longer manage without a wheelchair in her apartment, she made a written request to Keystone Management for a ramp to the entrance of her apartment, just to get into her apartment. She also requested an accessible shower be added to her first-floor bathroom. In a letter denying her request, the regional property manager stated, "Our contractor advised us that a ramp would not be possible as there is not enough room to install one to ADA code." Well, Pam Kish knew to call David Esau, and she asked him to look at Ms. Fry's front steps. Within 24 hours, Mr. Esau had drawings of a ramp and suggestions on how to install a shower unit. The Fair Housing Center then made a second request for a reasonable accommodation in writing, along with presenting Mr. Esau's design. A lawsuit followed, because they would not do it. But to settle the lawsuit, the ramp was built, the first floor bathroom had a shower added, and our complainant received a financial settlement, but was also able to remain independent in her home. On behalf of the Board of Directors, it is our greatest appreciation that we present this award to Mr. David Esau. You want to say something?
Not really.
You were never quiet on Thursday mornings with us.
Well, it's obviously unfortunate that the Fair Housing Center keeps finding projects for me to work on, but they do, and I'm happy to do it and to contribute to the community. So thank you very much. Sure. Okay.
You and I. Sorry. Oh, yes. Come on. Oh, sorry. That's okay. All right, thank you. Thank you. Now I get to pass the podium to our amazing director, Pam Kish, who has been with us from the beginning. She has kept this organization going even through those times of government shutdowns or no grants. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful director, Pam Kish.
Good morning. It's nice to see all of you here. Ann, thank you, who has also been here at the Fair Housing Center since the beginning as a founding board member. I'm very happy to be here to introduce Fred Freiberg. Fred serves as the executive director for the Fair Housing Justice Center. It's a regional civil rights organization based in New York City that he co-founded in 2004. The Fair Housing Justice Center is one of the groups of plaintiffs that just settled a groundbreaking case against Facebook on the issue of discriminatory advertising metrics. So I don't know if any of you have read about that, but very interesting case. From 1999 to 2002, Mr. Freiberg worked at the Urban Institute to manage the testing of two national research projects. One, mortgage lending practices. One covered mortgage lending practices, and the other was the third and largest national study of housing discrimination ever conducted in the United States. Mr. Freiberg was the founder and first executive director of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council from 1977 to 1981. I first met Fred Freiberg in the early 1990s at a Justice Department tester training through the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit. He worked for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and he directed a national testing program that he helped to establish in the division's Housing and Civil Enforcement section. Mr. Freiberg is considered one of the nation's leading experts on the use of testing as an investigative tool for enforcing civil rights laws. His advocacy efforts extend beyond fair housing enforcement. He recently organized a year-long working group that brought together fair housing advocates and affordable housing developers and produced a new report laying out a comprehensive housing policy agenda for the state of New York. Another recent initiative of the Fair Housing Justice Center is an interfaith action network described as diverse religious congregations and faith communities, ordained clergy and lay leaders who share a commitment to fair housing and willingness to take action to address fair housing issues and concerns as they arise. The project is called Building the Beloved Community. We are fortunate to have a fair housing expert with such a depth and breadth of knowledge here with us today. Please help me welcome Michigander, Fred Freiberg.
Good morning. So I'm delighted to be here. I was particularly delighted when Kristen called me and asked me to be a speaker at the Fair Housing Center's 6th annual Fair Housing Breakfast. As Pam mentioned, I'm a native Grand Rapidian and Michigander. I don't say that in New York much because I don't think they know what I meant, but you do. And it's great to be back in my home state. As Pam mentioned, I direct the Fair Housing Justice Center, which is the only full-service fair housing organization based in New York City. Now, our mission is very similar to the Fair Housing Center's mission. We work to eliminate housing discrimination. We work to promote policies and programs that foster open, accessible, and inclusive communities. And we work to strengthen enforcement of fair housing laws. Now, in implementing that last prong of our mission, we have a number of national projects that bring me in regular contact with dozens of fair housing organizations across the country. And I want to begin by pointing out that you all are particularly fortunate to have such a champion for civil rights in the form of the Fair Housing Center of Southeast and Mid-Michigan. And I say that as a person who works with a lot of organizations around the country. I've worked with and provided training to the talented and dedicated staff of the center, and I've known its founder and executive director, Pam Kish, for many years. Now, I'm a lot older than Pam, but we both have had two very influential mentors and colleagues in common in the form of the late Marv Thomas and the late Cliff Schrupp, both of the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit. They were outstanding role models and teachers for both of us. So the first thing I want to do this morning is implore you to support this worthy organization because they continue to work very hard with extremely limited resources to combat illegal housing discrimination and reduce residential segregation. They work every day to keep alive the goal of the civil rights movement, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described as building the beloved community, a place free from discrimination and segregation. They need and deserve your continued support, so thanks to all of you for making time to be here today. Now, it's been over 50 years since our nation made fair housing the law of the land. Yet today we see hate crimes and other acts of intolerance on the rise. White supremacists and other hate groups proliferating. Illegal housing discrimination is still pervasive. And while our metropolitan regions have seen a modest reduction in residential segregation, most areas of the country are still characterized by pronounced patterns of racial and economic segregation. Despite 5 decades of fair housing policy, America is still very divided. And discrimination continues to wall out African American people and other people of color, people with disabilities, and other populations from having equal access to housing opportunities. Over the past 50 years, government at all levels has moved with all deliberate lethargy to enforce and fully implement fair housing laws. Now, why is this the case? What are the lessons to be learned? What I'd like to do this morning briefly is to deconstruct the walls that divide us and focus on what I believe to be the most significant reasons that we have not made more progress. And I want to say there's good news and bad news, and I'd like to sort of supplement my introduction that Pamela gave me by saying that I've been in this work now for 43 years, 43 of the 50 years that the fair housing law has been in existence. And over those 43 years, I have supervised more than 12,000 investigations in 20 states. I have personally participated in 1,500 tests around the country. I have been named as a witness in 400 fair housing lawsuits. And I have testified, deposition and trial testimony, 56 times in cases filed in state and federal court. And I offer that, I point that out only to say that my views on housing discrimination have been shaped by a lifetime of experience directly immersed in the enforcement of fair housing laws. Now, during this time, I've witnessed many changes. And what I've got to tell you today is there is some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that I believe it's fair to say that there are more housing providers and others who comply with fair housing laws today than there were in 1976 when I first started working in this field. One example that I always point to is that in 1976, there were no real estate agents in Milwaukee who would ever come forward and report housing discrimination, or much less agree to serve as witnesses and testify against other agents when their buyers or renters were openly discriminated against. It just never happened. And I'm pleased to say it does happen more often today. And that's good news. The bad news and the most striking change that I've observed concerns the nature of housing discrimination. When I began in this field in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, much of the housing discrimination was still quite overt, and the walls of ignorance and bigotry were quite visible. Doors were routinely slammed in people's faces, and it was not unusual for housing providers to actually openly declare their discriminatory preferences. Now, I don't want to suggest today in any way that these practices are a relic of the distant past, because unfortunately, they indeed are not, and overt discrimination does still occur based on race, national origin, family status, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and many other protected characteristics. But when these practices occur, they can usually be documented with relative ease. Often consumers file complaints, and there's at least the potential for some effective enforcement response. For most of us, these visible walls became familiar symbols of housing discrimination, the type that we all loathe, and that fair housing laws were intended to eliminate. But this is no longer the most common type of housing discrimination. I've argued for many years that we have to replace that image of a slam door with a revolving door, where people are politely and courteously escorted in, out of, and ultimately away from the desired housing. And it happens in such a subtle fashion that most people don't know they're being discriminated against. And that represents a change in the way discrimination has occurred. Today, we need to focus on these subtle forms of housing discrimination, or what I would term invisible walls. These invisible walls take many forms. The problem with these visible walls is that they're almost never detected by ordinary consumers, and they're difficult to document. And I have often pointed to the fact that this creates a vicious cycle, because most of our enforcement agencies, and I'm not counting the private groups like the Fair Housing Center and ours, but most public enforcement agencies are structured around a sort of complaint responsive paradigm. So if consumers don't know when discrimination is occurring, they're not going to file a complaint. If they don't file a complaint, no enforcement action is going to be taken. And if no enforcement action is taken, the discrimination continues. The invisibility of housing discrimination essentially ensures its sustainability. Or as another role model and mentor of mine, James Farmer, late civil rights leader and the founder of the Congress on Racial Equality, said, he said it another way: institutional practices, it seems, perpetuate themselves by their invisibility. In many respects, the erection of these invisible walls should surprise no one. After all, most lawbreakers try hard to elude detection. Bank robbers wear masks, so you can't identify them. Burglars wear gloves, so they don't leave fingerprints behind. And all of us, when driving down an expressway and we see an unmarked squad car on the side with radar, what do? We all slow down. So, we have to understand this is not a difficult concept to grasp. Most of us learned this when we were children. If you're going to break a rule or the law, you do everything you can do to try not to get caught. The same is true with violators of the 50-year-old Fair Housing Act. Subtle discriminatory practices are designed to elude detection so as not to overtly offend or cause a complaint to be filed. But these pernicious practices, I would argue, are every bit as effective in restricting housing choice as the more overt variety, and too often they go unchallenged. So one lesson we must learn is that the only way to effectively ferret out these subtle discriminatory practices is to replace the current complaint-responsive enforcement paradigm with one that places a greater emphasis on conducting proactive systemic testing investigations. And the persistence of these invisible walls, it's not the only factor that argues for a change in our enforcement approach. There are also many vulnerable and marginalized populations who, even when confronted with more overt discriminatory practices, are unlikely to file complaints, come forward, and assert their fair housing rights. Recently, with evidence we gathered from a large-scale systemic testing investigation, my organization filed federal lawsuits against 11 operators of nearly 100 nursing homes and assisted living facilities for discriminating against deaf prospective residents by refusing to provide American Sign Language interpreters. Now think about it. If you're a deaf resident in a nursing home facility or an assisted living facility, and you are dependent upon care from that facility 24/7, are you really going to file a housing discrimination complaint? Very unlikely. Undocumented immigrants, refugee populations, Muslims, the elderly, people with certain types of disabilities may be apprehensive for a variety of reasons about coming forward to file housing discrimination complaints. If we're going to remove existing barriers to housing choice, ensure non-discrimination, and reduce segregation, we need to reorder our enforcement priorities. The burden of securing compliance with fair housing laws should not rest solely on the victims of housing discrimination, but rather on the law enforcement agencies that are supposed to be protecting all of us from this societal harm. And my organization can attest to the fact that testing is still the most effective investigative tool for documenting these subtle discriminatory practices. Now, the organization I run has a fairly unique testing program. When I first came to New York City in 2004, I wondered where I was going to get testers from. It wasn't the kind of place that people would routinely volunteer their time to work on this activity. So a friend of mine said, well, 2 out of every 10 people you meet on the streets of Manhattan are underemployed actors looking to supplement their income. So I went to an organization called the Actors Fund, and we struck up a partnership, and they immediately provided us 30 people to employ as part-time actors. And today I'm pleased to say we have 165 professional actors who participate in testing investigations for us on a regular basis. They're a very diverse group, all races and national origins. They speak 28 languages collectively. They're very educated, and they give us an immense capability in conducting these investigations. So much so that over the past decade, evidence from FHJC testing investigations have supported dozens of legal challenges that have changed the way many housing providers do business. These legal challenges have opened over 65,000 units of housing to populations previously excluded and yielded a total monetary recovery in excess of $34 million in damages and penalties. Now, to illustrate what I've been talking about, I want to share a few stories. And Pam knows I have 1,000 stories, but I'm just going to share a few of them today with you to talk about contemporary housing discrimination. And I want to put a footnote and an exclamation point next to this one, because I don't want to hear anyone walking out of this room and say, wow, did you hear those stories? New York City must be a horrible place to live. Because what I want to emphasize is that while these stories all did occur in the New York City area, they could have occurred anywhere in this country. There's nothing there are some things that are particularly bad about New York City, I'll admit that. But discrimination is not the salient feature that I would say makes it a less desirable place to live. Discrimination occurs all over this country, and these experience, and I've actually documented it in many other states, including this one. So there's nothing peculiar. So I want to just point out that in our rental market, we still find widespread housing discrimination based on race, national origin, disability, and source of income. When it comes to race and national origin discrimination particularly, there's evidence that violators have learned how to disguise their discriminatory conduct with a friendly disposition, polite conversation, and good manners. And a number of years ago, I had a landlord who owns 1,000 units in New York City. He had a flagship, 32 buildings. He had a flagship property in Astoria, Queens. And we tested it as part of a systemic investigation, and we sent 4 teams of African American and white testers into this building. And every time African American testers went in, they were told no apartments were available. And sometimes as soon as 15 minutes after they left, a white tester would approach and was told about and shown available apartments. Pretty clean cut. It was probably the most flawless investigation I had ever coordinated. And provided very compelling evidence. But one of the things we noted as we listened to the recordings, because we record our testing the same way the Fair Housing Center does, one of the things we listened to was the fact that this agent was very outgoing and talkative with each of the African American testers. He would say, oh yes, I just had this guy, I've been holding this apartment for 8 months for him, and it just came available, and he was so happy. He came down the other day and he fabricated this whole elaborate story that was a complete lie. But it was done to make the person feel better that they had just been told there was no apartment available. So there was more conversation with the African American testers, whereas the white testers, it was here's the apartment, here's the rent, here's an application. If you want it, give me a call and you can have it. And so this was very telling in terms of the sort of new mask of discrimination that is out there. And then I had another call in 2016, and I see enough gray hair in this room that I'm not going to have to explain this one. I spoke to a college class recently, and I made this statement, and everyone looked at me like, who are you talking about? So I got a call from someone in the media who said Norman Lear would like to have lunch with you. And I never imagined in my life that the legendary TV producer and writer would ever want to have lunch with me. But he wanted to have lunch with me. He was 93 years old at the time. He wanted to have lunch with me because he wanted me to send him out on a test. And he asked if we could match him with an African-American tester and send him out. And I did. We had just finished an investigation. There is a documentary called America Divided. It's funded by the Epix cable station, but you don't have to have Epix to see it. It's on Hulu and Amazon as well. It's 5 episodes of 8 stories, and one of the stories is about housing discrimination in New York City. And I invite you all to check it out because it's a very powerful story. So Norman went and he was told about 2 apartments, and then the African-American tester I had matched him with was told nothing was available. And he captured it on film, and he went back and then confronted the landlord with what had happened. And it's just a very powerful documentary, and we need to see more of that. But again, shows you how subtle this is, because he asked the African-American tester who was matched with him after we got done with the testing, if you had been actually looking for an apartment, would you have filed a complaint? And of course, the response was, no, I had no idea that this guy was not telling me the truth. And so that's part of what we see in New York on a pretty regular basis. We had another race case that I have to tell you because it kind of combines the good news and bad news. We had a young white woman who was getting married. She and her fiance were looking for their first apartment. They went and found a broker who could show them available rentals in Queens. And they went and saw several buildings, and finally they decided on the one they really liked, and they moved in. But that's not the end of the story. They moved into the place, and then a neighbor across the hall came over to just welcome them to the building, and just as a neighborly thing to chit-chat with them about moving in. And one of the things that they were told by this other tenant was, oh, we're so glad to see somebody move in because this unit's been vacant a long time, because there was a black family who wanted to live here, and the owner and the broker told us that they decided they were never going to let black people move into this building. And so our white woman who ultimately became a complainant was devastated, because not only was she now realizing that she was living in a building that would be forever white because of the landlord's practices, but that she'd also been an unwitting pawn in a racial conspiracy. And that bothered her greatly, which I think is another sign of the fact that times have changed a bit. That there's this young white woman, there's nothing particular about her background that would say that, she was immersed in the civil rights movement or anything of that nature. She just thought this was reprehensible, that this landlord would do this. So she called us, filed a complaint, we did 2 tests, found African-American testers were taken to one dumpy unit in Astoria, and the white testers were taken to multiple nice buildings in Astoria within the same price range. And in one of the tests, a white male tester, the agent's talking to me, he says, now this other place I'm going to take you to, this owner's really picky, so I've got to make sure it's you and your wife that come with me to see that unit. And our tester followed his script, and he said, well, my wife is at work, and she's just much too busy. She can't possibly get off to, and she's entrusted me to make the decision on what apartment we're going to rent. So I really need to, is there any way around this? And the broker said, well, I had the owner's really fussy, so, well, maybe there is one way. Do you have a picture of your wife? And now the young white male who was doing testing for us is actually a gay man in real life, but he has a lot of friends. He's in the Broadway circles and so forth. So he happened to roll up his phone and found one picture of him with his arm around a white woman. He said, here she is. This is her. And the broker said, oh, yeah, she's fine. Okay, let's go. And that was it. And that's what race discrimination looks like today. And this is not the first time or the last time it's happened in one of our testing investigations. I'm going to leave rentals in a minute, but I want to mention one more thing, and that because I think it's a universal issue around the country, and that is source of income discrimination. It can often be a proxy for race and disability discrimination. It's massively found all around the nation. Now, in New York City, we have so many rental subsidy programs that New York City in 2008 passed a source of income law that protects anyone with a rental subsidy. And so we've been busy enforcing that law since it was passed. And there's still massive noncompliance, but we're making some headway with some of the bigger landlords and finally getting compliance. One of the subsidy programs in New York is a subsidy program that goes to individuals living with symptomatic HIV and AIDS. And it's called HASA, the HIV/AIDS Services Administration. And we got a complaint from a young man who had been living on the streets, homeless, living with AIDS. And he received a HASA voucher, and he was all excited because this would finally put a roof over his head. And it was at a rent level that you could actually get a fairly decent apartment. So he did what a lot of New Yorkers do. If you've ever been to New York City, you walk down a commercial street and you see a real estate office. There are these postings in the window of all their listings and ads. And he saw several listings which were within his price range. And so he walked into the real estate company. He said, I saw these ads in the window and they're for, $1,150 a month, and I can afford that. And are they still available? And the broker said, yes, they're available yet. Would you like to see them? And he said, yes. I've been looking, around because I've got a rental subsidy. And, I'm sorry. Those listings, those are for regular people. You need to go in the back to a woman who handles the program people. And there's a separate set of listings. Now, he ended up renting a unit from this real estate company, and it turned out to be a nightmare. Dead cockroaches throughout, wires hanging out of the walls, a fundamentally unsafe place to live. So we did some testing to several of the places that he went and filed a federal lawsuit based on source of income and disability, since all 33,000 of the people who get HASA rental subsidies in New York are people with disabilities. So we allege both disability and source of income. We drew a visiting judge who was the most conservative judge we've ever been before. He was appointed by Richard Nixon. He's 90 years old, and he had never found in favor of a plaintiff in a civil rights case in his life. And we went into the trial with this guy, and we thought, and he couldn't hear either. And so he would keep yelling at our attorneys, stop yelling at me. And when the attorneys stopped raising their voices, then he said, I can't hear you, speak up. And it went through a whole trial like that. And then finally we got to the end of the trial, and And we thought we had won. I spent 5.5 hours on the witness stand in that particular case, and he wrote a decision, and he said the evidence presented by the Fair Housing Justice Center was not just a thick cloud of smoke, it was a smoking gun. And we won, and the really nice outcome to this case is that the young man who came to us with a complaint in the beginning ended up getting damages. He used those damages to go back to school, and he's now a counselor in Washington, D.C., working with individuals that have HIV and AIDS. So it's a great outcome. Because the defendants in this case, two big real estate companies, decided to fight all the way to trial, they faced $500,000 in attorney's fees that they had to pay as well. And one of them, we actually put the largest real estate company that handles rentals in Manhattan out of business. And the other one had to pay substantial damages. So, the fair housing laws can work, but source of income discrimination is very important to work on because it affects large numbers of people. Now, moving to sales a bit, I do want to say a couple things about sales discrimination. I think in the coming months and years, you're going to see a resurgence of racial steering cases brought around the country. And I can't tell you exactly why I know that to be a fact or why I would make that projection, but I believe you'll see a lot more activity in this area because I think it's still a very serious problem in the real estate industry. Now, we don't have, in New York City, 70% of the people are renters. So we don't have a large home ownership market in New York City, but we do have a lot of co-ops and condos, 300,000 co-ops to be exact. And that's where a lot of sales occur. And we had a case a few years ago in which there were these two large co-ops in the Bronx. And when you think of a co-op, and I think of a co-op, I usually think of a building that's operated very much like condos with individual apartments and so forth. But this is not what I'm talking about. These two co-ops were single-family home neighborhoods. One had over 750 homes, and the other one had about 300 homes, all single-family homes, and they were operated as a co-op. Now, this co-op had an unusual rule. It said to purchase into that co-op, you had to have letters of reference from 3 existing shareholders. Well, the co-ops were all white, so if you were an African-American or Latino buyer, you would have to get 3 white people to provide references for you to get in, which seems like a major feat to accomplish in New York, given how segregated things are. So we looked at this case as a systemic investigation. We found a real estate agent who had been selling homes in these two co-ops for 45 years. She'd actually lived in both communities, and she'd been selling co-ops for 45 years in these communities. And we tested her. It was a test that lasted, it was one of those tests that never end. It lasted for like 2 months. We had an African-American and a white couple go out opposite each other to look at co-ops. The white couple was taken to see 10 co-ops in these 2 developments and was encouraged. The agent said things like, oh, this place is like Shangri-La. You're going to love it. You don't have to lock your doors. Your children can run outside in their bathing suits and you don't have any worries about them. And just all these, effusively positive things about these communities to live in. And then we sent in the African-American couple, and this agent, over time, talked to them over and over again about how and the white couple, I should tell you too, also said, but we don't know anybody there, so how are we going to get these letters of support? She said, don't worry about it. I'll help you with that. We'll get the letters. So then we sent the African-American couple in, and she said, well, I'm not going to show you anything in these developments because, number one, you're never going to be able to get the letters you need to get in. And number 2, you don't want to live there because these are awful places. They're so racist. This is Archie Bunker country, another Norman Lear reference. And there was a cross burning 10 years ago. And if you have a child, you definitely don't want to have that child raised in this environment and so forth. So I don't recommend you go there at all. So I've got one property I can show you. And she went and took them to a property that was over their price range, which was in complete disrepair and next door to a public housing project. And that was the only option they were given. And so we filed a lawsuit. The 2 African-American testers, the Fair Housing Justice Center, sued both co-ops and the real estate agent. We ultimately settled for over $500,000 between the 2 co-ops. But the real estate agent posed a more serious problem because she didn't have a lot of money. So the most we could probably squeeze out of her was $2,000 for each of the testers. And we thought, when we talked to the testers, they said, well, at least could she write us a letter of apology for how she treated us and what she did? And you'd think that would be a simple thing to ask a defendant to do. She was incapable of writing a letter of apology. Even her attorney drafted a second letter of apology, and she wouldn't sign it. So we said, fine, you don't want a letter of apology, then you're going to do something else for us. You're going to surrender your real estate license and never practice again in the state of New York. And she did. So we ultimately got her out of the business. And while developers of newly constructed multifamily buildings don't put signs out in front saying no disabled need apply, the visible failure to design and construct the housing in compliance with accessibility requirements sends the same exclusionary message. We find dozens of new buildings being built all around New York City and the suburbs that do not comply with the minimum accessibility requirements in the Fair Housing Act. I had a story to share, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one because I know you have a lot of work you do on accessibility and you have your own stories to share. But this is a major issue yet in our area, and I think in other parts of the country, that there seems to be a culture of indifference yet among many developers and architectural firms. Thank God to the award recipient today, because we need more architects and developers who care about this issue and want to make their housing accessible, but it's still a major problem. So a question I do want to ask you is, what happens when you get old, like me, and you can no longer manage to live independently, but you have no major health problems, so you really don't need nursing home care? Where do you go? Well, some people would say, go to a family member, live with a family member. Others would say, what? Assisted living. Isn't that what assisted living's for? Go to an assisted living. You get 3 meals a day. You get housekeeping taken care of. Somebody reminds you to take your medication and so forth. That's where you go. Well, unless you use a wheelchair and you live in New York, because we found that assisted living facilities in our systemic testing investigation were not willing to admit anyone who used a wheelchair, even if it was just part-time. And we thought, this is just remarkable. We got a complaint from a woman who had lived in this assisted living facility for a number of years, and we'll just call her Jane Doe, and she then went for some rehab assistance at another facility, and then she was finished with her rehab, and they said, you can go back now, but just to avoid any possibility of you falling in the future, you need to use a wheelchair part-time. She could transfer, she could get out, use the facilities, get into bed, that type of thing, but she needed a wheelchair at least part of the time. And these were accessible facilities, elevator buildings that were perfectly accessible. And they said, no, she may not come back to our facility as long as she's using a wheelchair. And we said, well, what's up with this? You know, there's plenty of people, maybe they've used a wheelchair all their life and they get to a point where they need assisted living. You mean there's no options to go into assisted living when you get to that position in your life? And the answer is no, not in New York. Because what we found when we probed further on all these tests, we tested 4 assisted living facilities, is that they hid behind a number of things. First they said it was the fire code, but that was a lie. And then they said, well, the Department of Health has regulations that prohibit us from admitting people who use wheelchairs. And we said, how can this possibly be? And it was. Turns out the Department of Health, only the Department of Health in New York and the state of Mississippi have a rule that you can't move into assisted living if you use a wheelchair. So so what we did was, after we found out that this rule existed, we tested the state. And we had someone pose as a consumer who had been having problems trying to get her father into an assisted living facility. And we kept calling their consumer hotline and asking about how you handle this. And they said, well, you know, I think the facility can refuse your father. And so let me get a supervisor. And it kept getting bumped up till we finally got to a regional supervisor. And the regional supervisor said, no, absolutely, the facility can turn your father down. You know, after all, you should think about it as being in their own best interest, because they might roll over someone in an emergency. And we actually have that on a recording. So we sued the state of New York and 4 assisted living facilities, and we're pursuing that litigation right now. I also mentioned discrimination in the sales market, and I know there are a number of lenders here, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't say that in the 50-year history of the Fair Housing Act, only 2 lawsuits have been brought that alleged discrimination based on race and national origin against lenders based solely on testing evidence, and our organization brought both of them. And we've settled them, and we're working on a third case right now. What I want to tell you all is that lending discrimination still exists. And African Americans and whites, when they go in to look to find out how much they can afford in terms of a loan, and we did 130 tests with minority testers who had better credit, more income, less debt, and a better credit score and greater assets, and compared to a white tester who had less in each category. And white testers, 60% of the time, came back with a higher home price and loan amount suggested to them by the loan officer. There's something wrong with this picture. It still occurs, and in fact, we're now the only organization in the country that's doing testing for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau nationwide. And you may have read, those of you who are lenders may have read a while back that Bancorp South in Mississippi settled a case of discrimination for $10.6 million. We did the testing in that case. And I have to say, this is also an issue that I think more and more fair housing groups are going to revisit in the future, because it's very hard to do the testing, but if you can do it, I think it will show that all things are not equal when it comes to obtaining a home mortgage. I want to mention just a couple other things, and then I will close. We also sue a lot of suburban communities, housing authorities for discrimination, all with testing evidence. We have residency preferences that exist in many of these communities that give a preference to white local residents for housing assistance. Some are actually built into their zoning codes. We have sued 6 different suburban jurisdictions and housing authorities, and we're currently in federal court against one, and we've now claimed intentional discrimination because we found evidence that it wasn't just a disparate impact, but it actually was established for intentional racially discriminatory reasons. And then finally, these communities don't put out signs and say for whites only, but effectively that's essentially what they're doing when they adopt a residency preference or residency requirement to only keep their own residents, give their own residents access to affordable housing or to housing programs. And then finally, Pam mentioned the Facebook case, which we also did testing with, by the way. We set up bogus real estate companies for fair housing organizations, and we went to place ads using their targeting tools, and we placed ads we actually went to place ads that were discriminatory, that either excluded women or families with children or people with disabilities and whatever. And each time we went to place the ads, a little box popped up from Facebook saying, your ad has been approved. And so we never posted them because we didn't want to harm anyone in the housing market, but we got to a point where we could show in all 4 cities when these ads were placed that Facebook was sanctioning discriminatory targeting of ads. Now, when I say discriminatory targeting, they allowed you to include or exclude certain populations based on some protected characteristics under the Fair Housing Act. And even prior to our lawsuit, just so you know, ProPublica had done research and exposed the fact that they allowed people to target and exclude based on race and national origin. And if you haven't heard this story, I'm going to give you a little detail that you might not have heard, and that is that you could include or exclude African Americans from seeing your ads. You could include or exclude Hispanics from seeing your ads. You could include or exclude Asian Americans from seeing your ads, but you can't exclude white people because white people are the norm. So Facebook did not allow you to exclude white people. So anybody who says this was just an affirmative effort and so forth, that's ridiculous. It's just not true. And so one of the new frontiers for us, and we did get $1.95 million, we overhauled their entire platform for advertising. There's a separate portal now they can go to, and you can't target, and we eliminated hundreds and hundreds of possible characteristics that you could target with. It was an awesome undertaking over a course of a year, but we finally got it through, and we got $500 or $500,000 in free in credits and advertising on Facebook as well. So we can now advertise non-discrimination on Facebook. And so it was a great outcome. It was kind of a monumental decision for us, and I think it should change the way they do it. But I want to point out that The issue of big data and algorithms is a new frontier for fair housing because it can actually serve as another invisible wall. It can actually determine who's going to see what housing ads and so forth, and that can have dramatic impacts on where people live in our society. I want to just say in closing that the other lesson we've learned since 1968 is that the original foundation on which the walls that divide us were erected, or what some have called the architecture of discrimination, is proving to be quite resilient and durable. Those of you who attended the breakfast last year heard from Richard Rothstein, whose book, The Color of Law, describes how over many decades public and private entities collaborated and socially engineered through intentional policies and practices the patterns of segregated living that are still conspicuous in most of our metropolitan regions. While the apartheid policies that were implemented in the early part of the last century are gone and fair housing is now the official law of the land, the perilous consequences and lingering effects of these segregationist policies on people and communities of color have never been adequately addressed or redressed. The resultant inequalities that stemmed from preserving the white privilege and wealth under the guise of protecting property values in white neighborhoods accounts in no small part for the racial wealth gap that persists to this very day. What is clear is that we need to systematically dismantle all remaining barriers that constrain housing choice and reinforce or perpetuate residential segregation. We also need to repair the harm already inflicted on people and communities of color, as evidenced by the myriad inequalities that continue to flow from this discrimination and segregation. That is why, as advocates, we are absolutely outraged that HUD would seek to weaken a rule and eliminate tools that assist local jurisdictions to meet their duty under the Fair Housing Act to affirmatively further fair housing. This has been a part of the law that has been largely ignored for 50 years, and under the Obama administration, a rule was finally promulgated that would guide communities in how to actually implement that part of the law, and this administration has removed it and is trying to change it and weaken it. We are equally distressed that HUD is now attempting to rewrite a rule that offers guidance on how to apply the well-established legal theory of disparate impact, which our organization routinely uses in our enforcement work. And again, this is so well established under federal law, and the federal government right now is busy trying to dismantle that rule as well, so that communities are not, that defendants are not burdened with cases where disparate impact is alleged. Some of the cases I mentioned today, the residency rule cases, those would not be able to be brought unless you had evidence of intentional discrimination, and you shouldn't have to have that burden. So we've got to resist efforts by this administration to turn back the clock, to cause further delays, and to hobble implementation and enforcement of fair housing laws. You know, the concept of building walls was very much a part of the last presidential election, and sadly, it continues to be part of our public discourse today. I don't know about you, but those fearful, mean-spirited chants of build that wall still reverberate in my ears. As people concerned with fairness in housing, we're dedicated to tearing down walls that divide us. You know, American poet Robert Frost, in his poem Mending Wall, I'm sure many of you know this, challenged the old proverb that good fences make good neighbors when he wrote, quote, "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense." But too often we don't question the visible or invisible walls around us. We do not try hard enough to understand all the ways in which some are unfairly advantaged by those walls, while others are offended, excluded, and harmed by the same walls. Another great American poet, James Baldwin, once stated in an interview, "It's what segregation means. You don't know what's happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know." But we must make it our business to know about these walls, to care about those who are being walled out or harmed, and devote the resources needed to systematically and permanently dismantle these walls. And we need to do this with all deliberate speed. Only then will we be able to repair the many decades of social and economic damage caused by these deep divisions. Only then will we be able to collectively work to create truly open, welcoming, accessible, and inclusive communities. Only then will fair housing become more than a trite slogan or a poorly enforced law, but a living reality for every person who cares to call this nation their home. Thank you very much. Thanks. So I've been told we have some time for some questions.
Yes, can you hear me? All right. Thank you, Fred. I could actually listen to stories for many more hours, but I'm sure it probably shouldn't keep everyone here. We can open up the floor for question and answers. If anyone has reflections or maybe more time for stories.
There's
then?
one in the back.
So the wheelchair is in assisted living. Are you also? So you're working on New York and the wheelchairs for assisted living. How about Mississippi?
No, we have a service area just like the Fair Housing Center does, so we're not working in Mississippi. But and sadly, I think there's about to be a fair housing group started in Mississippi, but Mississippi has not been served by any fair housing group for years and years. There isn't any organization there, so it's a real failure. Unfortunately, there's vast areas of the country that don't have private organizations like this. Another reason to count yourself as very fortunate that there is a group here to do this work, but that rule still exists in Mississippi. It probably is something we could notify some advocates in Mississippi about, and maybe at the outcome of our case, we'll just send them the decision and let them know they can check out the Mississippi law and take care of it.
So here in Michigan, it's been difficult trying to find out about. Thank you. Hi. Here in Michigan, it's been difficult to try to find out about laws that might regulate senior living housing. There are old age homes, basically, which is the law, and that's for assisted living, presumably. But there's nothing related to senior living housing where people can be just as vulnerable in many respects. And I was wondering, do you know anything about other states that have regulations related to senior living?
Right. Often independent living, the senior living you're talking about, is not covered by state regulations. Now, states vary greatly, so there could be a state out there. I'm not saying uniformly that doesn't happen, but in most states you don't have regulation of the independent living facilities. And Kristen, I have to not resist your invitation because I have a great story about senior living in New York. We got a complaint from a senior living facility. It was independent living. It was in Staten Island. And we got it from a disability rights group that called us and said they won't accept wheelchair users at all in this independent living facility. And it was brand new and totally accessible and so forth, and they wouldn't accept a wheelchair user. So we didn't just test that place. We tested, there's a chain of 5 of them around the New York City area. So we tested all 5. And wow, did we get our eyes opened about practices. The Manhattan one is my favorite. The Manhattan facility, we sent a tester in who had a relative who used a wheelchair. And the tester was told, oh, your dad can't come in here if he's using a wheelchair now. You got to come in vertical. Those are the exact language on the, and so our tester said, well, what if my father gets in there and he needs to use a wheelchair, simply because of aging and so forth. And they said, well, that's okay, and we'll allow it then, but he has to eat in a separate dining room. And so our tester, getting more and more curious with these responses, and says, why, is one dining room accessible and one isn't? Oh, no, they're both accessible. But, it depresses the elderly people to see people using wheelchairs. And so we got stuff. We got another one. Not one of their facilities would not allow motorized chairs under any circumstance, and we just got policies at each and every one that were discriminatory in one way or another. So we went after that entire chain. So this is an area, you're right in saying this is an area. San Antonio Fair Housing Council just brought a series of complaints against senior living facilities for those kinds of issues as well. Some independent living facilities require HIPAA release to get your medical records, and they have no business getting any of that. They're not providing medical services or anything, and yet we're seeing this in different parts of the country. So there are a lot of, and with my generation becoming a very large generation in the society, more and more of us are going to look at senior living, assisted living, and nursing homes. And we got to make sure these facilities are actually operating in a non-discriminatory manner, because there's going to be a lot of people harmed if we don't change these practices. So it's a great issue and needs to be addressed.
Just a quick follow-up. So do you also litigate on the Americans with Disabilities Act in addition to the Fair Housing Act?
Our focus is fair housing, but many of our cases also make claims under the ADA. Even our design and construction cases, public areas and so forth, there's often ADA applicability in those situations. Housing itself, no, but common areas and buildings and so forth very often are covered by the ADA. So we often have those claims attached to our cases. Also the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act as well, if there's public subsidies going into the building.
Hi, should I hold it? Or? You had mentioned that you think a kind of trend in the future is going to be more steering, racial steering. Are you worrying about targeting minority populations with crappy loan products again, or are you worried about exclusionary sort of steering away from places, or both? What did you mean?
Well, there are a lot of groups that work on predatory lending in New York, so we've tended not to focus on that. So we've looked at more of the exclusionary and the differential treatment that's occurring for even lower middle class people who just want to buy their first home. We're finding there are radical differences in how people of color are treated compared to white people, and so we're addressing that issue pretty singularly right now. And I think the steering issue is going to come up more and more in the real estate market. And again, I can't elaborate a lot on that, but I think there's significant evidence that's going to be released in the next couple of months, which is going to suggest that we've still got a very serious problem in the real estate industry with racial steering. And I did a presentation to the New York Association of Realtors recently, and when I was talking about this, all I saw in the room were nodding heads, saying, yeah, there is a big problem. And they all knew people that they knew were involved in steering and so forth. So I don't think it's going to come as a surprise to the industry, but perhaps the increased enforcement activity will come as a surprise, because really most of the racial steering cases were brought in the 1970s and 80s, and there haven't been a lot of cases brought since that time.
Oh. Thank you for helping me. I purchased a home in 2011 here locally, and then again we expanded family, purchased one in 2017, and I noticed a change in the way that our realtor worked with us in 2017, and I think this is a common practice now in Ann Arbor, being a sort of a hot market, lots of buyers, not a lot of inventory. That realtors are encouraging buyers to write letters,
Yes,
and with pictures of the families that want to buy the houses. And I'm curious about
posting them on Facebook. And,
Yep.
Yeah.
And just curious about, is that discrimination? It seems like it is.
Well, it can be, but I think the only way we'll know for sure is to send people of different races into these offices to inquire about housing and then see how they're treated. And that's the way we can get at the bottom of whether these practices are being done in a discriminatory fashion. I suspect strongly that they are. We also know there's significant differences now. If you go out to buy your first home, many companies will suggest to you that you should see a lender first to find out what price range you're in, get pre-qualified, and so forth. And what we're finding, though, in some instances, is that it's a much greater likelihood that you're going to be told they won't serve you unless you get pre-qualified if you're a person of color than if you're white. That if you're white, this is one thing we noticed in lending and we've noticed in real estate sales. If I go in as a white guy and I tell the lender or the realtor, I make X amount of dollars, here's how long I've been on my job, this is the money I got in my bank, they just believe me. But if you're a woman, if you're a person of color and you go in and make those assertions, well, do you have your tax statements? Do you have some proof? Could you give me some pay stubs? And so forth. And this white male privilege has got to stop. It cannot continue. People have to be treated the same way. That's what the Fair Housing Law requires, and that's what should be happening, but it's not.
Thanks for being here and for your great speech.
Sure.
You mentioned ways in which big data is being used to advance illegal discrimination. Can you offer some ways, perhaps, that fair housing organizations are using big data to deter discrimination? For example, mapping and some of the opportunities that big data presents to fight discrimination.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with the premise of your question. I think to the extent that technology is being used more and more to discriminate against people, we have to find ways to use technology more effectively to fight that discrimination. Now, on the one hand, with Facebook and with other big data tech companies that are manipulating data, I think it behooves us to find out what they're doing, and you can do that through testing and so forth. We do most of our systemic testing investigations in New York are done through a customized GIS mapping program using data, and we have about 100% track record in terms of identifying where violators are likely to be in the New York area, which is why we bring a lot. We probably bring as much or more litigation than any other fair housing group in the country. And no, it's not just because New York is a terrible place to live. It's because we've got very strategic about targeting places that we think, using data again, targeting places. We did some targeting for source of income discrimination using the mayor's office on data analytics in New York, where they scoped out where the high-performing schools were, low crime rates, all the things that matter to somebody and will impact people's lives. And they then produced a list of all the landlords in those neighborhoods and what their rent levels were and so forth. So we're just testing away right now. And we're going to have a lot of cases as a result of using technology in that manner. So there are things that you can use, technology out there, and a lot of the training I provide to fair housing groups and so forth around the country, we talk about those technology tools and how they can be more effectively used. But it's one of those fields, as you know, that's constantly changing. So, you find something today and it doesn't exist, but tomorrow it will, and then you need to get on top of it. Facebook, we thought there were problems when the ProPublica article came out. It confirmed there were, but we certainly thought after 2 exposés they would have cleaned up their act, but no way. And I'm not even confident they're going to totally comply with us right now, but we've got a monitoring responsibility over a period of years to make sure that they do comply. But this is a whole new field. I mean, this is going to open up to a lot of new strategies. But testing, one thing I would emphasize, though, is testing is still central to it. It's not just a matter of gathering data and so forth. Testing is really central to understanding what happens in the marketplace. And there's little substitute. With lenders, for instance, for years, there were data reports on who was getting mortgages, who wasn't getting mortgages, and you could do statistical analysis, regression analysis, and you could see that race, there was a high probability to a degree of statistical significance that race was a factor. But when you go to court, you got to have proof that discrimination occurs, and that may not be sufficient. But when we get these tests and they're recorded and we have stark differences in treatment between how people are treated, that's the kind of thing where you can actually affect some change. There's not a good answer that a lender has to a well-constructed test. So that's why I still hang my hat strongly. I think testing, I would argue actually that testing is more important now than it was in 1976 when I started in this field. You hardly needed testing. Discrimination was so in your face at that time. It was easy to document, and some people wouldn't even deny they were discriminating at that time. Now you actually need testing more than ever because people just don't know what's happening in the marketplace.
Thank you.
Hi. I was curious about something you mentioned about source of income discrimination, and I think I heard you say that it was a local New York ordinance around that. Is that correct? Because I'm thinking in my head about the relationship between local regulation versus state law, and I know that New York is able to regulate a lot of things that we are not able to do, local municipalities in Michigan. So I guess I'm curious if you could give us a little more explanation about
Sure. So
where you rely on local law versus state law. Or,
yeah, well, you probably have human rights laws, though, at the state and local level. It's just a matter of amending those laws to include source of income discrimination as a protected characteristic. And then it should explicitly include people who have rental subsidies, because there are some states, Wisconsin is one I know, that has source of income, but it does not cover rental subsidies of any kind. So It's very important. There's 17 states, I think, now that have source of income in their state human rights laws. The Poverty, Race, and Research Action Council website has a great analysis, and it was just updated recently with all the states and localities that have source of income protections. And I would recommend going to that site and checking that out. But it's actually relatively easy to construct. The laws are not that complicated. Enforcing them becomes a little bit complicated, but we have 90,000 homeless people in New York City, 24,000 of whom are children. And so rental subsidy programs are life or death for these households. And so we had the city council finally said, over and above the mayor's veto, incidentally, said, no, this law has to be passed because we have a crisis here, and people with subsidies need to have protections when they go out into the marketplace. So Legal Aid and our organization and one other group have been bringing most of the lawsuits involving source of income. Again, government hasn't been doing a whole lot, but we've been bringing as many cases as possible against some of the largest landlords. We just sued one that controls 22,000 rental units in New York City and got them in compliance with the law. So it's a big enforcement. Passing the law is actually the easy part. The hard part comes later in making sure it's adequately enforced.
Good morning, first of all. I'm not in this field, I'm in the field of education, and they're very similar in how these things go on. What are the red flags? What are the red flags that say we need to go in somewhere?
Well, I'll share a few secrets with you. They're not really secrets because sometimes it's in plain sight. The co-op developments that we tested that I told you about, that was an article in the New York Times where it talked about this reference requirement of shareholders. And so I read the article, and immediately my mind goes, we have to investigate this. This is outrageous. I think other people read it and didn't think much of it, but I immediately knew we had to add that to the site. The use of GIS mapping for rental discrimination is a surefire way. If you see a large area with, in our case, large areas often have 50-plus unit rental buildings, and you see it's next door to an area that's largely African American or Latino, and there's a paucity of African American or Latino tenants in that building, then if you just test the buildings in that neighborhood, you'll have a lawsuit before you know it, because that's where the violators are. And like I said, it's rarely been the case that we haven't been successful with that targeting and finding a case. So that's another secret. There's other data you can look at that will be helpful. I mentioned that what we did with source of income discrimination, trying to help families get into areas which have higher opportunities and so forth. And I think that's important data to look at as well. I mean, where you live, you all know this, you're all fair housing people, you know this, but where you live matters. And it can determine everything from what kind of education you're going to get, what kind of job you're ultimately going to get, what kind of food you eat, what vulnerability you have to various diseases. You're going to have your life expectancy is determined by where you live. And so if we don't start paying attention to that and paying attention to the fact that segregation is preventing populations from accessing those opportunities, then shame on us. I mean, this is 50 years of not doing something about this problem, and we've got to start paying attention to it. So, data. There's all kinds of data. I train groups on how to do testing and how to target to find violators, but it's different for every single field. For lenders, for conventional ways of targeting that a public agency might do are very different from what we do, and I think I can at least prove ours works. Take that for what it's worth.
Hi, we're with the Fair Housing Center in Toledo, and so welcome, and it's good to see our folks in Michigan. So congratulations on the Facebook case.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you were getting a lot of advertising dollars on Facebook. So I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but we place a lot of Facebook advertisements, and they tend to get flagged because we're targeting, like say we place an ad that deals with disability, they get flagged because we're targeting disabled folks. So sometimes I think the algorithm still is,
Yes.
working against us, or they get flagged as political. And so you can register as a political operative or, things
Yeah.
like that. So there's a lot of, unintended probably consequences going on there. So I'm sure you're aware of all that, but,
Yes.
Anything you can do to fix that algorithm, we are with you 100%.
Well, I think maybe they may be less careful now about the general Facebook platform because now there's a separate portal for housing ads where they do have to carefully flag things and so forth. So hopefully it will free up some of the associational stuff, some of the stuff that fair housing groups do that are getting flagged now. We recognize this is a problem. In fact, I read one of the first comments in response to an article that came out a couple of days ago was from a person who'd placed an ad and it had been disapproved by Facebook because the word red was in the ad. And what possible discrimination that necessarily connotes, it had nothing to do with people or anything. It was just the color red was mentioned, and so Facebook flagged it as being an ad that couldn't appear. So Facebook has a lot of issues, as you all know. You've read the articles. They got a lot of problems, even beyond fair housing and so forth. And I think the underlying algorithms are still the fundamental issues, and our case couldn't get at some of those underlying algorithms within the larger Facebook platform. All we could do is look at the advertising platform and clean that up, and that's what we did. Did I see one other hand? I thought I saw another hand. I guess not. Well, thank you very much for being attentive, and I, again, appreciate the opportunity and support this organization because they need your help.
Thank you all for being here this morning. If you want to hang out a little bit and talk and informally or ask some more questions of our speaker, we'll be here for a little bit longer. And again, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next year.